Our next panel is Family and Women's Literature. Inez Frid returns as a popular moderator for this panel, and her extremely impressive professional background is in your program, and I encourage you to read about her because she does some really important work in our community. But the backstory on Inez is, if you have any connection to her on social media, you know that food and dogs compete for her attention when she's not working. And so her social media posts have you either your heart melting or your mouth watering. And she's a wonderful moderator, and you're going to really enjoy her. And I want to welcome Inez and her authors, Diane Chamberlain and Susan Wiggs, to the stage. Please give them a warm welcome.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you, Sue. That was a wonderful introduction, and I appreciate that. But I really do prefer under-promising and over-delivering. So it's a great privilege to be invited back to BookMania, benefiting the Library Foundation. I was just explaining to the ladies a moment ago that this is a beautiful public-private partnership between the foundation and the library system that improves the community in so many ways. So it's a privilege to be a part of this. When Jeanette asked me to be a moderator for this particular panel, in the past I've been a moderator for health and wellness, which is a topic I'm very familiar with. And when she asked me to do women and families in fiction, I paused for a moment because I might not do you justice as a moderator. And then she mentioned who I would be on a panel with, who I would be sharing this table with, Diane Chamberlain and Susan Wiggs. And it took me less than half a second to say, too bad for all of you. I want to be at this table with these two amazing women regardless. So thank you very much, Jeanette. Before I go into the books and the authors themselves, let me read you a little bit about each of them. Diane, at the far end here, is a USA Today and London Times bestseller author of 24 novels that have been published in more than 20 languages. I should put my glasses on. Diane likes to write complex stories about relationships between men and women, parents, children, brothers, sisters, and of course, friends. Although the thematic focus of her books revolves around family and love and compassion and forgiveness, there is an awful lot of mystery and drama and secrets and intrigue. And when you read The Dream Daughter here, you'll notice that all of those things are in there, even though the style is a little bit different than her books in the past. Diane's background in psychology and has given her a keen interest in understanding of how people tick, which is why her characters are so realistic and so relatable. Susan, right next to me, is a Harvard graduate and a former fifth grade teacher, fifth grade, correct? And with more than 50 novels, they have appeared in the #1 spot at the New York Times bestseller list numerous times. Also published in 20 languages and published in 30 countries. I don't know about you, but I don't think I could rattle off 30 countries. So that's very impressive. She is a 3-time winner of the Reader Award, and The Apple Orchard, which we already have one question for, is being made into a movie. Her books celebrate the power of love, and they are timeless, and the bonds of family and the fascinating nuances of human nature. Her curiosity really does come through in her writing, and it's intriguing. Publisher Weekly says of Susan that she writes refreshingly honest, and Booklist characterizes her book as true and real and completely unforgettable. And you will, when you read these books, if you haven't already, you will also find that to be true. So let's get the conversation started. And I just have a few breezy questions to get some chemistry going and get to know the authors a little bit better before we dive into the books. These questions are for both of you. You're both prolific. You have many books and titles under your belt. What was the name of your first book, and do you recall the year that it was published?
My first novel, which I don't recommend anybody read, is called Private Relations, and I finished it in 1985 when I was a medical social worker, and it wasn't published until 1989.
First novel, first published novel, because as you probably will hear from the authors here, the first thing you write is often not the first thing that gets published, and that's a blessing in disguise for many of us. My first novel was called Texas Wildflower, and it was a flaming historical romance, very hot, about, I called the couple the Bickersons because they bickered all through, and it was published in 1987. I was a young teacher, a young mom, I had a toddler, 2 dogs, a house, a very busy life, but I was always extremely focused on I wanted to write. I wanted to write the books that I love to read. And I did love to read romance novels. They got me all the way through college and graduate school. So thank goodness for that. And so, like Diane, and I have read Private Relations. It's an early book that was published 30-some years ago, and I like to think that I've progressed and evolved as a writer, and yet that thing is still in print, so it's got its readers. Thank you so much for being here. I'm just blown away by the interest and the commitment of this, and the love for the library that you all have, so thank you for having me.
Excellent.
From the past to the future, which will be a common theme today, what are you working on now, and when can we look forward to seeing it on our bookshelves?
I'm working on a novel. I'm actually done with it. I'm just doing revisions. It'll be out in early 2020. And right now, it's had many titles. We're having title war with the publishers, but it's called The Disappearance, and it's about a 1940 artist who was hired by the government to paint a mural for a post office, and she disappears during the painting of the mural. And then in 2018, another young artist is hired to restore the mural, and as she's restoring it, she begins to uncover some of the clues to the first artist's disappearance.
That sounds...
Okay, so how fast are we all gonna pre-order The Disappearance by Diane Chamberlain?
If that's the title.
Sounds so good, yeah. Yet to be titled. I have a firm title on my upcoming book. It's called The Oysterville Sewing Circle. And it's actually about a group of domestic violence survivors who needed a name for their support group that wouldn't attract attention to their issue. And it takes place in my home state of Washington, and it will be out in August. And I'm finished with the writing of that, so now it's the promotion of that. The book that I'm working on now that will be published in 2020 is called The Lost and Found Bookshop. And it takes place in a vintage bookshop in San Francisco, and I'm in the middle of writing it, and part of my little week in Florida here involves visiting with some independent booksellers and learning about their trade.
When you read a book, whether presumably somebody else's, maybe each other's book, do you prefer hardcover or softcover?
I don't care, and I also don't care whether it's an ebook or an audiobook, and sometimes I end up buying all four because I just want to be able to read wherever I am and listen to the story. So if it's a really good story, I just have to get it in every possible format I can.
Yeah, I too don't really have a preference anymore. I was resistant to ebooks at first, but I do travel a lot, and it's quite a blessing to be able to bring a huge library on one device. And also, you know, as aging sets in, it's nice to be able to make the type bigger, and so it has its uses. I do love a hardcover book, though, as almost a luxury item now, and one of the perks of working with the publisher that I have currently is that they take a lot of time and care in packaging the book. My books get end papers, those are these, the wallpaper on the inside cover, and they usually produce also a premium edition that has like gilt pages, so that always kind of makes me as a fan of any kind of book. But I'm like Diane, a book is a delivery service for a story, and however you access that is fantastic. And another little note about me is that I can never read my books after they're published. It distracts me. It makes me have regrets, and want to maybe like alter things in an already published book, but I always listen to the audiobook version, and because it's a different art form, and I love the dimension that a really good voice talent can bring to a story, and so I always get excited when my books come out on audio version, because that's my first chance to listen to it as a listener.
That's interesting, because I reread both of your books, and one of the things I say, well, it's scripted a bit later on in our dialogue this morning, is how your books complement each other. They're very different, the styles are different, but the themes are similar. But their voices really very much complement. Diane and Susan, your voices complement each other. So I think I'm going to read them in audiobook and see how that enriches the experience after the fact. So something to consider. Thank you for that tip. You answered one of my questions already, but I expect that you guys ladies do a lot of traveling. And when you travel, you bring things on multiple devices, as we all do. And I tend to overpack, not just shoes, but also books. What do you travel with reading material-wise when you travel for a short trip like this weekend, or on a longer, say, a research trip?
Well, on this trip, I'm traveling with my own work in progress. So I know it very well, and I just keep going over it and over it, trying to find those errors that I've made, because I'm so close to turning in the final draft. But like Susan was saying, when you read a book that's already published, like when I read this book, that's when I find that typo, that one typo that'll dog me and that I'll hear about from readers that I've missed no matter how many times I've read the draft. So on this particular trip, I'm reading this book again. I mean, I'm reading my new book again, but I'm also just finished Susan's book, which was wonderful. I finished it on the plane. Highly recommend. Has a great epilogue.
Mm-hmm. Which we won't go into.
Yeah,
No.
I travel with my Kindle, and exactly what you said. I have my work in progress. If I'm working on a first draft, it's a handwritten draft, written by hand. If I've already rendered it in type, it's on my laptop. So I work, but for relaxing reading, travel, it's almost always a really popular novel or a really intriguing work of nonfiction. So right now, gosh, I'm so terrible with titles. It's something like Let's Have a Meeting, and it sounds like it's a really boring topic, but it's a fascinating book about the sociology of having corporate meetings, which again, I'm underselling this book. It's really good. I'll have to look up the title. It sucked me in, and I can never get enough of the kind of nonfiction that seems to be about a mundane, ordinary topic that suddenly brings it to life in a really unique, fresh way.
Jeanette created these panels between these two gifted women and these two books that are very not similar, but they have similar themes and complementary themes. One of that I said makes them reading these two books together very enjoyable and enriching. I have not moderated fiction before, so I have this trepidation that I'm going to spoil it for all of you. So I'm going to ask each of the ladies just to give us a brief summary about their book, and then we'll get into the book. Diane, do you want to start?
Yeah, this book, if you've read my other books or any of my other books, I will tell you this one's a little bit different. but it's still very much about human drama and real people. And it is about a young woman named Carly who in 1970 has lost her husband in the Vietnam War. And then she discovers she's pregnant. And then she learns that her baby that she's carrying has a fatal heart condition. And then, so that sounds like a typical Diane Chamberlain book, I know. Then her brother, yeah, her brother-in-law comes to her and he tells her that he has a secret he has kept from the whole family, and that is that he is from the future, and that he knows that if she goes to 2001, 2001, that she can have fetal surgery on this baby and probably save the baby's life. Of course, she doesn't believe him. But he proves it to her, and he proves it to her because it's early May 1970, and he tells her something that's going to happen in a few days. Can anybody remember what happens in early 1970, May?
I don't know.
Kent State. So when it happens, she realizes that he must be telling her the truth. And he explains to her what she should do when she goes to the future. The way to get to the future is you have to step off something that is 16 feet above the ground. And she decides that the only way she can do this is if it's over water, and they happen to live in Nags Head, North Carolina. So I'm not going to tell you any more than that, except that everything goes wrong.
Now you know why I didn't give that summary.
So Between You and Me was written with a totally different title. So I'm not sure who you is in the title and who me is. That was a publisher's determination. But I think that it references the many intertwined relationships between the characters. And I call this story like a double fish out of water story. The first fish out of water is a young man who lives in an Amish community. He grew up Amish, named Caleb Stoltz, and he's in charge of his very young nephew. And they're in a very old order Amish community in Western PA. They're very observant, they're very conservative, and the young nephew gets mangled in a piece of farm equipment and has to be life-flighted to this glass and steel tower in Philadelphia, to this medical place. And so he's the fish out of water in that situation. And he meets a woman who is maybe one of my favorite characters that I've ever written. She's not a warm and fuzzy person, but she's such a striver, such a seeker. She's about to start her medical residency, and so she's doing a rotation in the emergency room, and this young boy comes in and his arm is off, and so she participates in that situation and gets involved in the family, and it really kind of forces her to examine her path in life. People who are very focused and very successful and high achieving seem to be, and this is probably of necessity, they've got their blinders on and they're following a path, one foot in front of the other, and then suddenly something happens that will change your whole life. And so this is about that moment and the way that she has to examine her own life and the choices she has to make. And there are parts of it that are not pretty, and there are parts that are not wrapped up in a bow, but she gets very involved in this family that's really struggling between being observant of their faith and their farming and family and the way that life revolves around that in their community versus the what's out there, the rest of the world. And so if you get the book, you can see that the end papers are a quilt, but the little illustration on the quilt is an airplane, because the Amish typically don't make use of airplanes, but they think of it a lot. So.
Both books, the one theme that is very prevalent in both books is strong women. And there are a lot of strong women in this room, so I know we're going to get some good energy on this conversation and relatability. Both of the key lead characters in the books are very strong women. And one of the things that I really enjoyed reading these books together is that, kind of like peeling back an onion, as we turn the page, we learn how strong they are. And then we're also witnessing them, those women, Carly and Reese, evolve. And each page and each chapter, how they sort of evaluate their life and become stronger in their own way, and with the challenges that they are facing in each of the chapters and each of their experiences. It was really lovely to watch them grow and to be able to also reflect on our own experience and relate to them. Could I do that? Would I ever consider doing that? And you'll have to read the books to answer those questions yourself. Were you inspired by somebody in particular in your life or in observing somebody else's life when writing Carly or when writing about Reese?
No. There's a short answer. I do tend to write about women who maybe start out afraid and then get stronger. And I think if that's inspired by anybody, it's myself, because I grew up a really scared kid, and I'm always trying to deal with that through my fiction unconsciously. But I know if I stop and think about it, that that's really what I'm doing, that I start feeling stronger as I create somebody who's getting stronger. And so with Carly, you know, she starts out really, really scared, but her motivation is to save her child. And so that's the way she puts one foot in front of the other and takes more and more risks. I grow through watching my characters' growth.
Reese or any of my lead characters, I'm sorry to say I kind of have a similar answer, although most of my characters suffer from a certain selective blindness and overconfidence. And their story is usually dealing with the consequences of that. And I was like the opposite of the fearful child or timid child. I was the one who, you know, went skiing and broke every bone in my body and jumped off of rocks and built wings because I thought I could fly, and you know, just gave my parents nightmares. And I was always the first one to get into trouble physically and in many other ways. And so the journey of a character like that is also a journey of personal growth, where they learn what their gifts are and what their limitations are, as well as what their true path in life is. There's a writing teacher that I know. He actually teaches screenwriting named Michael Haig, and he describes a character's journey as a character at the beginning of the journey is living in their identity, who they think they should be, the face they present to the world, the one that they have created for themselves because it's comfortable for them. And over the course of the drama in the book or the story, they find their essence. And I always try to write towards that moment at the end of the book where the character sheds her identity and finds her true essence.
That's beautiful. You both speak so fondly of your characters. Is there a character in your past book that has stuck with you, that sort of is always on your shoulder when you're writing the next book, and do you want to revisit her or him?
Do you want to go first?
Two sisters, actually. I wrote two related books called The Apple Orchard and The Beekeeper's Ball. They're one is about one sister, and then the next one about another one, and they have a mysterious missing dad. And I sort of pulled that thread through both books, fully intending to write a third book where all was revealed. But welcome to big business publishing. That publisher was acquired by a bigger publisher, and things changed within the publishing house, and book 3 was suddenly didn't have the fans in the publishing house that it had previously had, and so I started publishing other things. So I still think about, I think their names are Tess and Isabel. I think about Tess and Isabel, and I think you are going to find your dad. It might take me a while to get to you, but it's going to happen.
That's interesting.
For me, that first novel, Private Relations, that I don't want anybody to read, there was a guy in that named Cole. And Cole, he was like a romantic figure to me, an imaginary romantic figure when I started writing that book. And it took me years to write that book. So he stayed with me all those years. And the whole group of people that I created around him stayed with me. And I was telling Susan and Inez yesterday that when I reissued that book, 25 years after it was published, I called it the 25th anniversary edition, and I added an epilogue, and I aged all those characters 25 years. So Cole, who I had just adored, all right, I loved him. In my early 30s, now was pushing 60, and still really touches my heart. So I'll probably in another 20 years write about them again, and he'll still be a part of my life.
Oh, that's nice. Diane actually wrote one of my favorite books of all time called Keeper of the Light.
Well, thank you.
And I think about the young woman, I'm sorry, I don't know her name, but it was kind of she had an elderly lady who was her mentor, right?
I'm trying to think of her name.
I know, yeah. We both forgot. Anyway, but it was a lovely book, and it took place at the shore, so maybe I'm thinking of it now.
Nag's Head.
Yeah.
Another Nag's Head book.
Yeah, so.
Thank you.
Before coming wildly successful and full-time authors, and there's no doubt about it, after we spoke yesterday, you are full-time authors. This is not a passing career in any way, shape, or form, and requires a lot of discipline and work. You both had jobs that many of our fans, people in the audience here today, had and experienced. Diane, social worker in a high-risk maternity unit. Susan, school teacher. Those roles and the interactions with the people that you experienced when you were in those jobs, did they impact your writing choices and your styles in the future? Are there pieces from that part of your past that inspire or influence your stories today?
I think for me, I was a hospital social worker, and then I had a private practice with teenagers. And definitely, there's no one person that inspired a story, but it was just that understanding of how people tick that really, really helped me create believable characters. And I do think with the Dream Daughter, having been a maternity unit social worker, I would see babies back in the 80s that were born too early or too sick to survive, but I knew that as the decades wore on, that if they were only been born 20 or 30 years later, they could have survived. And that really was the inspiration behind the Dream Daughter. So I think my work inspired it, but not specific situations.
When I was a teacher, I did try to bring some of the fascinating research that I did for a book into the classroom in appropriate ways on the 5th grade level. I remember dressing up and having a medieval parade because I was writing a medieval romance and things like that. So I had fun with it in that regard. And anybody who's spent any time in a classroom with students knows that the teacher learns as much from the students as the students do from the teacher. And so I definitely accessed their energy and their spirit and their curiosity and all the things and their naughtiness. And one of my most popular books, and one that's been optioned for movies many times but never got made, was called Table for Five, and it was about a 3rd grade teacher. And I, to this day, still get feedback on that book from people saying, these kids, they're so real, how did you get these kids? And I'm like, well, I taught those kids. So and in all the years that I taught for 11 years total. In all the years that I taught, I mostly taught math, but there were, when you're a teacher of children, you teach the whole child. And I always remembered certain kids, and one of the fun things about social media is that people from your past can find you that you had long forgotten. And I had a note from a very successful writer named Catherine Howe, and she wrote the physics book of, I'm sorry, I'm mangling the title again. Anyway, it was a very successful fantasy novel from Random House, and she said, "You were my 5th grade teacher," and I always remember that.
Awesome.
So it was kind of cool that she came full circle. She followed me into publishing.
Thank you. That's interesting. There's 2 other themes that are very prevalent in both of these books. One of them is family, and I think we can all relate to this particular theme because we'll do whatever it takes to keep our family together or whatever is right for our family. We probably would cross huge amounts of water and time and whatever it takes to do that. The other theme, a little bit more abstract perhaps, is the essence of time and the passage of time and time travel also. Time travel isn't merely a theme in Diane's book, The Dream Daughter. It's very natural and very organic. I think when Jeanette asked me to do this panel and I said, yes, of course, based on the authors, and then I read the synopsis of Dream Daughter and I went, oh, that's interesting, time travel, that's not necessarily my thing. And as I started reading it, I realized it's not what one would expect. It's not Back to the Future. It's not DeLoreans. It's not crazy ideas in physics and things like that. It's much more organic and natural, and it becomes almost its own essence of the characters as a tool to create this courage for each of them without divulging the plot and where we journey with Carly. I'm curious, we start in the 70s. Did you pick the time periods and the eras in this book because you had a preference for those time periods, or was it more plot-driven?
I did have a preference for starting it in 1970, primarily because that was so much a part of my youth. And so I was interested in, exploring the war movement and how Carly would feel about things and how she would dress. And the other times that I pick were because of the needs of the story, the ages that people would be, that sort of thing. So that those time periods were really defined by what I needed to happen in the story at that time.
And in Susan's book, time is also an element, and it's in a way that's very different and built and engineered very differently than Diane's book. When Susan takes us through the chapters, we literally, or I felt, as if I was traveling from one place in time, and that place in time was probably only 100 miles or so from a big city of Philadelphia. Then that place stopped in time, maybe 100 or 150 years ago. And in the next chapter, we found ourselves in a very electric and frenetic and noisy and traffic-filled city. So there was these 2 eras that we, kind of like a tennis match as I was reading it, and maybe a tennis match of another era, I would say maybe Yvonne Lendl and Bjorn Borg, where it was much more elegant and polite. And she would volley us back and forth between these 2 eras. Susan, how did you do that without... how did you craft this without feeling that one era, the Amish era, where we step back in time, it's very culturally driven, spiritually driven, to the modern era, without making one feel more glorified than the other? I think a less gifted artist would maybe have one be more righteous than the other. How did you do that?
That's something that I think every writer struggles with. You want to present the story without judgment. I want the reader to live inside the story and let her experience it, because I often say a book is magic because every reader reads a different book. You read the book, you can read the same book, and if you're in a book club, you know this. You can read the same book somebody else read and have a completely different experience of the story. So I tried to be as objective as possible, and I also tried to be balanced in the pieces that I presented. I didn't want to gloss over some of the darker aspects of Amish life. Likewise, I didn't want to glorify every bit of, modern medicine and the challenges of that, and make one feel like it was the better choice. And for me, this was a miracle book because I got to the end and it was the deadline time and they had a pub date and they had all that. And I still hadn't figured out the ending because I painted myself into a corner. How is this finally going to end up for these people? Because they had a choice to make. And so I managed to struggle through that. I don't remember how, probably lots of phone calls to my friends and editors and so forth. So I think I was always conscious. I wanted to be as objective as I could so that the reader could experience her story.
Mm-hmm. You certainly did craft the beauty of both cultures and the other side of both cultures very equally and non-judgmentally, and that's why I brought that question up. Obviously, research is important to both of you. There was, I would expect, quite a bit of research in both of these books. Diane, history, neonatal care, intrautero medical procedures.
Technology.
Technology.
The technology between 1970, 2001, and a few other dates I won't mention changed so dramatically, and having to figure out what kind of phone would this person use, when you pull up the internet in 2001, what do you see? So those kinds of things I really wanted to get right.
What's your process for that?
My process is I call my neighbor, who is my research assistant, and say, could you find this out for me? And
don't you want to be her neighbor?
She will send me the documents, she'll Google it and she'll find out the answers and then send me the websites that I need to go to because I need to verify everything. But probably every page in the book, and this is probably true for you too, Susan, every page there's something that has to be researched in order to get it really, really accurate.
No, she's right. They say write what you know, but it's a little oversimplified because all we know is we sit alone in a room and we make stuff up. So that's not terribly dramatic. So we have to research people's jobs and where they live and what their day is like and what they wear and intricacies like that. For me, it's pure pleasure. I love being a fly on the wall, and so that's the fun part for me, is to find out and discover new things about whatever milieu I'm writing.
We have 5 minutes left, and I have a ton more questions, and I'm not sure they're the same questions you might have, so I'm going to start going to the audience questions. This one is for Susan. Do you outline your books first?
Yes, I do. I outline my books in terms of the beats of the story, and it usually is the character's journey. Who is she? Where does she begin? And I just write a freehand, several-page narrative to myself describing that, and I get a lot more structural as I get through the first drafts. But I always start with an outline. I share it with my literary agent, with my editor. We talk about it and fine-tune it, and I don't always know the end, specifically where and when and how it's going to play out, but I do enough so that I feel like I have a rough roadmap.
Diane, what inspired you to write about time travel? That's kind of a bold choice. And the second part of this question is, do you believe in it?
No, I don't believe in time travel, but it was sure fun to play with. It goes back to what I was saying about seeing those babies in the 80s and how they could survive today. And just, I don't know, my mind just kind of made a leap, a very weird leap for me, because if you know my books, this is unusual. But I just thought, what if I wrote about a character who could make this literal leap to a different time? So that's where it came from.
Susan, what title would you have given the book?
Between You and Me, what title would I have given it? I never did quite have a great title for this book, and so that's probably why they titled it for me, Between You and Me. I just called it Middle Grove. It's not a very dramatic, it's just the name of the town. And some books, they don't find their title. Other books, it just kind of, you come upon it and it's perfect, like The Lost and Found Bookshop, which is coming next, or The Oysterville Sewing Circle. I can't imagine the book being titled anything else. This one never really found its name, and so at one point it was The Amish Clydesdale Cowboy and the Cuban American Princess. But I was trying everything.
Sounds almost like a news broadcast. How do you separate your story idea from your real life? You must get immersed in your characters as you're writing them. How does your day work when you are so close to these people?
I think everybody, all my friends and my quasi-husband, has to listen to me constantly throughout the year talk about these people until they feel like they know them too. And for that reason, a lot of my friends are writers, are novelists. We get together, we brainstorm, so that I know that these are people it's safe for me to talk about, people who don't exist, and treat them as though they're real people. So really, in my day-to-day life, it is kind of hard sometimes to separate ourselves from our unreal world to our real world.
Well, I just become my character because she's always better looking than me and skinnier and has, better hair. So, I just let myself go.
Diane, I have to say, when you say quasi-husband, I always think that maybe you're on the fence about him.
No, we've been living together for 14 years, but we have made the decision not to get married because I did that twice before, and this one's working out much better, so why mess it up?
The questions I have remaining are this one probably we can go through in a minute or so. What is your writing routine on a day-to-day basis, say when you're in the midst of developing your book?
I go to writing like a full-time job, 8 hours a day at it, but it's a varied task. If I might be composing a first draft, I might be doing revisions. There's always business to be done, but I definitely treat it like a full-time job, a full and a half-time job.
Yeah, same here. I think it depends on what part of the book that I'm working on. In the beginning, I might just be reading research materials or traveling to wherever the book location is. And taking a lot of notes and thinking about the characters. The closer I get to deadline, the more hours a day I'm writing, and in panic mode usually at that point.
We have several more questions here, but as I've done in the past, I take the questions with me to the book signing table so that if there's some that we haven't been able to get to, we can have that conversation while we're signing the books. But I would really highly recommend everybody in this room reading both of these books together. And then, they've suggested some of their favorites already, which I know is on my book reading list right now. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was delightful. Thank you. You delivered.